Settle in. Take a slow breath. Tonight, we're going somewhere ancient, somewhere that most people think they know, but don't. Not really. We're going to Egypt. Not the Egypt of postcards and tourist photographs. Not the Egypt of golden sand and perfect pyramids glowing in the afternoon light. We're going to the other Egypt, the one that cracked, the one that bled, the one that after 3,000 years of almost unimaginable power, slowly, painfully, fell apart. This is the story of how the greatest civilization the ancient world ever produced destroyed itself from the inside and was finally swallowed by forces it could no longer control. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while. First, let's understand what we're actually talking about. Ancient Egypt lasted, in one form or another, for roughly 3,000 years. 3,000? To put that into perspective, the Roman Empire, which we consider one of history's great civilizations, lasted about 500 years in the West. The United States has existed for less than 250. Egypt outlasted them all. Egypt outlasted almost everything. At its peak, during what historians call the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, Egypt was the dominant superpower of the known world. Its pharaohs controlled territory stretching from modern-day Sudan in the south to the borders of what is now Turkey in the north. Its army was feared across the Mediterranean. Its gold was legendary. Its gods were worshipped everywhere. And yet, it fell. Not in a single catastrophic moment, not with a bang, but slowly, over centuries, like a great tree that has begun to rot at the root, still standing, still impressive from a distance until the day it finally topples. How does something that powerful collapse? That is the dark truth we're exploring tonight. The first crack appeared in a place no one expected, inside the palace itself. The year was around 1155 BCE. The pharaoh was Ramses III, one of the last truly powerful rulers of the New Kingdom. He had already done the impossible. Years earlier, a mysterious confederation of seafaring warriors, known only as the Sea Peoples, had swept across the Mediterranean, destroying empire after empire. The Hittites, gone. The Mycenaeans of Greece, gone. City after city across the ancient world, burned, abandoned, forgotten. Ramses III had stopped them. Against all odds, he had fought them off in a great land and sea battle and saved Egypt from the fate that had swallowed its neighbors. But he could not save himself from his own family. In what became known as the Harem Conspiracy, Ramses III was assassinated, murdered by members of his own court, led by one of his secondary wives and her son, who wanted the throne for themselves. The conspiracy was discovered. The plotters were tried, but the damage was done. The greatest pharaoh of his age was dead, and Egypt would never fully recover. After Ramses III came a parade of rulers who each bore the same name: Ramses IV, Ramses V, Ramses VI, all the way to Ramses XI, as if the court was desperately trying to recapture the glory of the past just by repeating the same name. It didn't work. Each successive ruler was weaker than the last. Political infighting consumed the court. Powerful priests accumulated enormous wealth and influence, rivaling and sometimes openly defying the pharaoh himself. The high priests of Amun in Thebes became so powerful that they effectively ruled Upper Egypt as a separate state, while the pharaoh sat in his palace in the north, increasingly irrelevant. Egypt had split, not from invasion, not from earthquake or flood, from within. And then the economic collapse began. Here is something most people don't know about ancient Egypt. It was, in many ways, a command economy. The pharaoh controlled the distribution of resources: grain, gold, land. The temples acted as banks and storehouses. The system worked, as long as the Nile cooperated. And for much of Egyptian history, the Nile did cooperate. Every year, like clockwork, the great river flooded its banks and deposited the rich, black silt that made the Nile Valley one of the most fertile places on earth. Crops grew, people ate, the empire thrived. But starting in the late New Kingdom, something changed. The climate shifted. The floods became unpredictable. Some years the Nile barely rose at all. Harvests failed. Grain stores ran low. Prices, which were set in grain, not money, became unstable. Workers stopped being paid. This is not a metaphor. In the reign of Ramses III, workers constructing the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings staged what is believed to be the first recorded labor strike in human history. They put down their tools and walked out. Their demand: the grain rations they were owed and had not received. Think about that for a moment. Even the men building the pharaoh's eternal resting place had stopped believing the system would provide for them. The desperation spread, and with desperation came something unthinkable: the violation of the sacred dead. Under the reign of Ramses IX, a wave of tomb robberies swept through the royal necropolis. Not petty theft, systematic, organized looting of the most sacred sites in all of Egypt. The tombs of the pharaohs themselves, the resting places of gods, were being broken into and stripped of gold. The trials that followed revealed something even more disturbing. Some of the thieves were not outsiders or criminals. Some were priests, officials, the very people entrusted with protecting the dead. The respect for the pharaoh's authority had collapsed so completely that even his eternal rest was no longer safe. Things had gotten so desperate that, at one point, the royal mummies had to be secretly moved and reburied in a hidden location just to keep them from being robbed again. And then came the outsiders. Egypt had always had enemies, but during its centuries of strength, those enemies had been kept at bay, or absorbed, or defeated, or paid off. Now, weakened from within, Egypt became vulnerable in ways it had never been before. First came the Libyans. They had been raiding and settling in the western delta for generations. Now, with Egyptian authority fragmenting, Libyan warlords seized control of the north and established their own dynasties. They sat on the Egyptian throne. They wore the double crown. But they were not Egyptian. Not really. Then came the Nubians from the south, from the ancient kingdom of Kush. Ironically, the Nubian pharaohs who took control of Egypt in the 8th century BCE were, in some ways, more traditionally Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves. They revived old religious customs. They built pyramids. They genuinely believed in the gods of the Nile. But still, the native Egyptian royal line was gone. Then came the Assyrians, one of the most feared military powers of the ancient world. They swept into Egypt from the northeast, sacking the sacred city of Thebes, a city that had stood for over 1,000 years, and stripping it of its treasures. Egypt recovered briefly under the Sate pharaohs of the 26th dynasty. A last flowering, a final attempt to recapture something of the old glory. For about 150 years, it almost worked. And then came Persia. The Persian Empire under Cambyses II invaded Egypt in 525 BCE and conquered it with alarming ease. The last native pharaoh, Psamtik III, was defeated, captured, and eventually executed. Egypt became a Persian province. It would never again be ruled by a native Egyptian for any sustained period. There were brief rebellions, brief periods of independence, but the trajectory was set. After Persia came Alexander the Great, who conquered Egypt in 332 BCE and was welcomed remarkably as a liberator, a pharaoh in the Greek tradition. After Alexander came the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that ruled for nearly 300 years. And after the Ptolemies came Rome. In 31 BCE, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the extraordinary, brilliant, multilingual Cleopatra VII, lost the Battle of Actium to the forces of Octavian. She took her own life shortly after, and with her died the last remnant of pharaonic Egypt. The Roman Emperor Augustus had himself depicted in the temples as a pharaoh, wearing the double crown, making offerings to the gods. But it was a costume, a performance. The thing itself was gone. 3,000 years of civilization, pyramids that still stand, temples that still hold their colors after 4 millennia, a writing system of breathtaking complexity and beauty, an understanding of astronomy, medicine, architecture, and statecraft that shaped every culture that followed. And at the end of it all, a queen alone in a palace, a Roman fleet in the harbor, and a world that had moved on. How does something that powerful fall? Not all at once. Never all at once. It falls the way everything great eventually falls, through 1,000 small failures. A pharaoh murdered by his own family, workers unpaid and forgotten, priests who forgot they were servants and began to act like kings, a river that stopped cooperating, neighbors who sensed weakness and moved in, and a people who had believed for 3,000 years that their civilization was eternal, who discovered in the end that nothing is. The desert is quiet now, where those great courts once echoed with ceremony. The temples still stand, but their priests are gone. The hieroglyphics on the walls speak in a language that took centuries to decode, because for a long time, no one alive could read them. But they are still there, still speaking, still patient. Let that stillness settle around you now. The weight of 3,000 years resting gently. You are warm. You are safe. The ancient world is very far away. Rest.